Okay, thank you. Okay, gentlemen, we're going to start. Okay. Thank you for joining us for this congressional briefing, which is a collaboration between Representative Lou Correa and JINSA's Gemunder Center for Defense and Strategy. We are honored to have joining us today Dr. Michael Makovsky, Ambassador Eric Edelman, John Hanna, and Jonathan Rui. Dr. Makovsky is President and CEO of JINSA. Ambassador Edelman is the co-chair of JINSA's Iran Policy Project and is counselor with JINSA Gemunder Center. John Hanna is a senior fellow at JINSA's Gemunder Center, and Jonathan Rui is JINSA's Director of Foreign Policy. The panel will be discussing U.S. strategy to prevent a nuclear Iran. JINSA has a lot of information on this topic, which you can find at our website, jinsa.org. During the webinar, you may submit questions through the Q&A box on your screen. For those in the audience, you're automatically muted and your video is off. I would like to invite Mike to start the discussion.
Thanks, Harris. I want to thank Congressman Correa's office for hosting this. I want to thank you all for joining, and obviously thank my colleagues for joining. I'm just going to make a few introductory remarks. I was supposed to be in Israel when we planned this, and because of the Gaza war, I had to reschedule. I'm leaving today, so I got to get moving on that. But the substance will be. So I'll just say a few comments. JINSA stands for Jewish Institute for National Security of America. We were founded in 1976. We focus on security matters in the Middle East. The Iran issue has been our longest standing policy issue that we have focused on. We have tried to be bipartisan in our effort originally. Actually, it was originally co-chaired by Dennis Ross and Ambassador Edelman until the 2015 deal was announced, and then it was just chaired by Eric. We have a number of retired U.S. military officers, generals, and admirals involved with us, as well as some of the folks on this Zoom, such as Eric and John Hanna, who's now a senior fellow with us. Fortunately, look, I would just make a few quick points. I think the most important thing for the staff and for members of Congress is that whatever emerges out of Vienna is that the Congress do a serious review of it. I think that's the most important thing. A colleague of ours who's all involved in our task force is involved with us formally, though not on the Zoom. Steve Rademacher wrote an excellent op-ed about this a couple of months ago, which we're happy to share, which I think is definitely worth reading or rereading, about the legal requirements under INARA, the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, of Congress's responsibility to review whatever emerges out of Vienna. So I think that's the most important thing. On the substance, I would say this. I'll leave it to my colleagues to explain why we think what the Biden administration is doing is the wrong course on Iran. We strongly oppose getting back into the JCPOA. We were opposed to it originally in 2015, and we don't think there will be once you get back in, there won't be a second, longer and stronger deal in any way. But I'll just make 2 points. I think that what has been missing in U.S. policy, certainly with this administration, and was missing for many years in U.S. policy, including with the Trump administration, until I would say the last year, was a credible military option. Until I think the Soleimani assassination in January of last year, I think we lacked that credible military option for a number of years before that. I think that's the pressure, that's the element of pressure that has always seemed to have proven the most effective with the Iranians, is the military pressure. They never violated Netanyahu's 2012 warning at the UN, where he drew a red line on a picture of a bomb at the UN General Assembly. They actually took pains not to violate it, I think, and there have been other instances where the Iranians have shown that a credible military option is a very important component. There are other important components, but I think that's the most important. Um, the second issue is, if it looks like, it does seem like there will be some agreement coming out of Vienna soon enough, and once there is, and assuming everything proceeds, that there will be, the U.S. will re-enter. I think the most important thing then for Congress, uh, if that indeed happens, I hope it doesn't, but if it indeed happens, as it seems like it will, I think then it's the most important thing for Congress to focus on is how to bolster Israeli capabilities. As I think they have proven, they continue to prove that, especially as we're retrenching more from the region, not just with this administration, but in previous administrations, for the last, um, over 10 years. I would say that they have proven to be a very effective advancer of U.S. interests, and based, if reports seem correct, they're the ones conducting the sabotage on the nuclear program, setting it back a bit, and doing other things to check Iranian aggression on the ground. They're going to, if the U.S. re-enters, it will put Israel in a terrible spot, and our Arab allies. John Hanna will discuss that. But I think uh, we need to do what we can to give Israel its military capabilities to defend itself, and I think prepare for what I think is a likely a major conflict with Iran and Hezbollah and other Iranian-backed forces. And we've listed, and Jonathan really could discuss some of the things that we've talked about that we could give Israel to bolster their capabilities. But I think that should be the second focus of Congress if everything goes forward with the JCPOA reentry. I'll stop right there, and I might close. I'll be on, but I might turn off my video. But thank you very much for your time, and I'll turn it over to Ambassador Edelman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. I'll just make a couple of framing comments for the discussion, and then I guess pass the baton to John to talk about our allies in the region and the strategic situation that we face there. First, I would say that, as Michael just said, we have a long-standing body of work at JINSA going back to the period before the JCPOA of studies, and I don't want to kind of go over the ground. We have a recent report that we just posted a day or so ago, which I encourage folks to look at. And one of the things that I think has been a theme of the reports has been that the agreement originally reached in July of 2015 had a number of deficiencies. And in particular, we raised concerns about the timelines for the various restrictions that were levied on Iran for enrichment in the original agreement. Some of the concerns we had as well about inspections and the transparency of Iran's nuclear program to the IAEA after the JCPOA was reached, accounting for the past military dimensions of Iran's activity, which was called for in the JCPOA, but which Iran essentially did not really comply with. I'll come back to that in a second. And the fact that so many of Iran's troublesome behaviors, its development of ballistic missiles, its proliferation of ballistic missiles to the region, its disruptive behavior throughout the region were left unaddressed in the JCPOA. And to some degree, members of the Biden administration have tacitly admitted the gravity of some of the deficiencies we pointed out, because they have called for reaching a new agreement with Iran that is longer and stronger and meant to address some of the deficiencies that we've identified over the years in the agreement. I think the concern we have in the reports that we have issued back in March and again a day or two ago is that the United States is on a course that is going to actually rob it of any leverage to get a longer and stronger agreement, that we were about to walk back into the JCPOA and likely to give up whatever leverage we may have, and which was generated by the maximum pressure campaign under the Trump administration to actually get a longer and stronger deal. This webinar is incredibly timely because just yesterday, the Director General of the IAEA, Rafael Grossi, gave an interview to the Financial Times in which he pointed out that the levels of enrichment that Iran is now engaged in since it left the parameters of the agreement a year or so ago of 60% are levels of enrichment that have only been reached by countries who have developed nuclear weapons program. And moreover, he emphasized something that we have emphasized in our reports, which is that the idea of just going back to the four corners of the 2015 JCPOA in light of Iran's deployment of advanced centrifuges, IR-2Ms, 4s, 5s, and 6s, and its development of new underground facilities, either a completely new facility at Natanz or an expansion of the existing facility at Fordow, make it very difficult to just go back to the original terms of the agreement, because you can't unlearn what Iran has gained from the research and development activities and the production capability that they have developed, which makes the short timelines of the JCPOA even more worrisome than they already were, in the past. Another development that occurred yesterday was the Guardianship Council in Iran eliminating Eshaq Jahangiri and Ali Larijani, two so-called moderate candidates for the presidency, which leaves it likely that one of three very hardline candidates, most likely Ebrahim Raisi, will emerge as the next president of Iran. I mean, it could also be General Rezai, the former head of the IRGC, or Salil Jalili, former negotiator of on the Iranian side. But that in turn raises the question of how worthwhile any agreement reached between now and June 18th will be after a hardline Iranian government returns to power. I want to make a couple of more points and then turn it over to John. Mike raised the question of congressional oversight, and I think that is extremely important. It may well be that the administration is forced by the Iranians to actually turn to Congress, because the Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, has said several times that he expects whatever agreement emerges from the Vienna talks to be legally binding, which I think would require some kind of congressional action. But moreover, the Obama administration, when it negotiated the JCPOA, repeatedly promised Congress that non-nuclear sanctions would remain on the books against Iran, sanctions that had to do with Iran's support for terror, which we've just seen recently in terms of its efforts to provide Hamas with a supply of, and Hezbollah with a supply of rockets, mortars, and missiles, that its ballistic missile programs and proliferation, its human rights violations would all still be subject to sanctions. And of course, the Iranians are demanding that those sanctions that were levied on the IRGC as an institution, the central bank, the national oil company, the national shipping company, be removed. Now, the question is going to be, how does the Biden administration deal with those sanctions? We've seen some comments on background from American diplomats in Vienna, suggesting that those sanctions were levied in bad faith as a way to scupper the JCPOA, make it impossible for the Biden administration to get back into it. But it raises some very serious questions in my mind if they're just going to lift those sanctions on that basis, what the evidentiary basis is for that, And what does that say about the career professionals at Treasury and the State Department, et cetera, who were involved in levying those sanctions? I think it would be a very serious step that runs counter to the intent of Congress, and therefore requires some very careful congressional oversight. I should have mentioned that Iran's hostage taking and its election interference were other bases for the levying of these sanctions, and so I think that's an important point. Final point, and then I'll kick it over to John. We raised in 2015 concerns about Iran's past military dimensions of its nuclear activities. We were concerned because in 2011, the IAEA, in its November 11th compliance report, in I think what was Annex K, outlined a number of concerning activities that Iran had engaged in that had been alerted to the IAEA by over 10 different countries' intelligence agencies. The administration, when it negotiated the JCPOA, assured everybody that Iran would have to account for all of this in a accounting that the IAEA would have to approve. In the end of the day, the JCPOA was drafted in such a way that essentially the Iranian government got to grade its own compliance, and because it didn't want to be responsible for overturning the apple cart and stopping the deal, the IAEA ratified this and closed the nuclear file, despite saying that Iran had not responded in a way that allowed the IAEA to conclusively resolve all of the issues that had been raised. Since that time, in 2018, Israel was able to smuggle out of Iran the archive of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, the late Iranian physicist who was responsible, the leader of the Iranian nuclear program. And David Albright at the Good ISIS, the Institute for Science and International Security, and one of his colleagues have just published a 500-page monograph based on that archive. I commend it to people. It raises enormous questions about the famous 2007 national intelligence estimate that concluded that Iran had halted its nuclear program in 2003. John Hanna and I still have the scars of the interagency battles over the language that was used in the key judgments of that NIE. I'm happy to say that, John, a cursory reading of David Albright's book suggests that you and I were right and the intelligence community was wrong, because basically the archive demonstrates that the activities weren't halted. They were just transformed into different channels that allowed Iran to have greater deniability about its weaponization activities. So with that, and I guess the final point I would make about that is, until all of this is resolved, it's impossible to have any confidence in the IAEA's regular reports that Iran is actually abiding by the JCPOA or not, because if you don't have an adequate baseline, there's no way to actually be able to, with any confidence, assure people that Iran is in fact not engaged in a bunch of covert efforts to weaponize the uranium that it is busy enriching. So with that, let me stop and turn it over to John.
Eric, I think with your forbearance, we're going to go to Jonathan Rui first to talk in a bit more detail about the analysis and the specific conclusions that emerged from this week's JINSA report.
Fair enough.
Thank you, John, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So my colleague Blaise Mishtal, who just joined, he and I will go through a lot of the analysis JINSA has performed on Iran's nuclear program and expand a little bit on sort of where we see hurdles to rejoin the JCPOA and negative consequences therein. As Ambassador Edelman mentioned, returning to the deal is no simple flip of the switch, just because we know what initial compliance looked like before the U.S. left the deal and before Iran began serially violating it. Doesn't mean that getting back to square one is so simple. And partly this is concerning just the things Iran can actually reverse. It's a lot of these violations include running new centrifuges, expanding R&D activities, as well as growing its stockpiles. I'm happy to get into a lot of the more technical details in Q&A if that would be helpful. But I mean, right now, I think some of the key Iranian nuclear violations that are proving very difficult. One is just the sheer amount of low enriched uranium they've accumulated, and there's all these different percentages. And as Ambassador Edelman mentioned, the head of the IAEA saying that the 60% level they're currently enriching at is inconceivable unless you're pursuing a weapons program. But I think the real, and that's important, don't get me wrong, but I think the key metric to look at here is Iran's accumulated stockpile of 20% enriched uranium. And the numbers can be a little confusing, but suffice to say, the jump from 3.67%, which is what the JCPOA permits, to 20% is actually a much bigger jump than going from 20 to 60 or even 20 to 90, and 90% is bomb grade. And so currently, at least if you trust what the Iranians are saying, because the IAEA data is a little spotty at the moment, Iran currently has about 90 kilograms of this 20% stockpile. They'd need about 150, 160 kilograms to have enough to have a bomb's worth. And based on our analysis, they're probably going to reach that point at this rate later this summer, August, September timeframe. So that's something I would certainly flag for everyone, because as Mike mentioned, in 2012, that was Netanyahu's literal red line that he drew on the bomb. So these are all things Iran's going to have to reverse that could at least technically be undone back to square one. And as Ambassador Edelman mentioned, there are also several bells that can't be unrung, both the R&D knowledge that Iran is gaining by running all these advanced centrifuges in violation of the deal, also their production of uranium metal, which could be used to essentially take fissile material and put it into a warhead. Even if they undo that stockpile, which is also a JCPOA violation, they certainly can't unring the bell that in terms of the knowledge they've gained from learning how to produce that material. So basically this paints a more complex picture than just simply saying, let's, if we went from A to B to get to where we are now at the Vienna talks, we can just go back from B to A and get both sides back in the deal. And even if you are willing to go back in the JCPOA while allowing Iran to retain some of these more intangible advances like R&D know-how, but also the more tangible ones like the centrifuge production facility that is currently under construction underground at Natanz, and also the expansion of the Fordow facility. Even if you're willing to sort of imagine a world where Iran can retain those advances while returning to something like the letter of the JCPOA, even then we're talking many months, I think, to get back into compliance. We've got actually a handy chart from our report in March, which lays out where Iran's nuclear program is now compared to where it was right before the JCPOA. And in many ways, Iran's more out of compliance now than it ever was before the deal first went into effect. And even then, the Obama administration estimated back then that Iran would need up to a year to bring its nuclear program into compliance. So we're not talking a simple flip of the switch, even if a deal is secured in Vienna. Ambassador Edelman also covered the issues on the US side in terms of sanctions. The Trump administration built this sanctions wall, which again, I'm happy to go in this in more detail in the Q&A, but essentially the United States can return to the letter of the JCPOA while still retaining these terrorism designations and other such designations that had nothing to do with the JCPOA. And why that really matters is Iran's narrative ever since the deal was first agreed in 2015 is they never got the sanctions relief, they were promised or that they expected as being the commensurate benefits with rolling back parts of their nuclear program temporarily under the JCPOA. Despite the fact that in 2015, Secretary Kerry essentially went on a world tour promoting Iran as open for business. So that's why now you're saying the Iranians aren't just happy with JCPOA sanctions, the nuclear-related sanctions being lifted. They're talking about the United States has to remove all sanctions in one go, and then Iran has to verify it before they're willing to roll back parts of their nuclear program. And so you've even seen last month, a State Department official said the United States was exploring sanctions relief that would give Iran the economic benefits it expects from the JCPOA, which essentially means removing these terrorism designations on Iran's banking industry and probably on the IRGC as well, given how intertwined they are with Iran's economy, both licit and illicit. And that brings us to what Mike mentioned at the outset, which is these, and as Ambassador Ellman covered, are the sort of the separate political hurdles in both the United States and in Iran to getting a deal done. There's the Rouhani administration, the Biden administration, at least superficially or officially agree on the desirability of getting back into the agreement. But obviously Congress has a very important role to play in both reviewing any either JCPOA return agreement or even an interim agreement to get us back toward the JCPOA, similar to what happened in 2013 before the actual deal came to fruition. But part of the problem I think you're seeing there, and something that Jintz has been very focused in on, but I don't think you see as much in the reporting, which is, Iran doesn't just sort of come into these negotiations in good faith or seeking sort of earnest compromise. They keep ratcheting up their counter pressure to get more leverage at the negotiating table. But what this does is keep expanding their JCPOA violations. And so last month you had this explosion at the Natanz enrichment plant, Iran's main nuclear facility. But what this actually did was take offline, at least according to Jintz's estimates, a lot of the centrifuges that Iran had in compliance with the deal. And so we've potentially seen a pivot now where Iran's main enrichment fleet is essentially all in violation of the JCPOA. And so we're seeing Iran, at least from reporting we've heard in Vienna, Iran is very insistent on being able to keep some of these centrifuges as part of a return to any agreement. So that's something I would certainly flag for Congress as a major concern, because with these centrifuges, Iran needs less space to enrich more quickly. So it's a lose-lose proposition if you're trying to contain Iranian breakout capability. And obviously now, Iran is building up leverage also by restricting access to international inspectors, which, given how relatively close Iran is to approaching a breakout capability, and we can obviously discuss that more in detail if you'd like. Any restriction in transparency, which is sort of an Iranian hallmark in the past, is whether it's weaponization activities or now it's enrichment activities, I think is also something that's highly concerning. And we've bought a month-long respite just earlier this week, but that's an issue I think that's not going away, especially if talks continue. So yet, despite all these hurdles, both the Biden and Rouhani administrations are making certainly concerted effort to try to get back into the deal. And for Jinsa, this raises the concern, as you can probably guess from the issues I've spoken about, of the United States giving up more to Iran to get less in return in order to get back into something approaching the JCPOA. But essentially, there's no quick, clean, or clear return to something like pre-May 2018, where both sides were in something like normal compliance with the deal. But with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Blaise Mishtal, who can talk a little bit more about the Biden administration's approach.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you all for joining us. I wanted to pick up where Jonathan left off and where our report that we just released yesterday called "No Deal Remains Better Than a Bad Deal" picks up, which is if we take off from Jonathan's analysis that whatever might come out of the Vienna talks and whatever might be described as re-entering the JCPOA is not actually going to be the JCPOA itself, but what we call probably some sort of a more for less agreement where the United States gives up more sanctions relief than it did under the original deal, and Iran provides less nuclear compliance than it did under the original deal, then that really calls into question whether the Biden administration is going to be able to achieve its own objectives vis-a-vis Iran. And at least in our analysis, it seems that there's three main objectives that the administration has laid out for its Iran policy. The first is to prevent a nuclear Iran, which has been the policy of at least the last four administrations, and is certainly a major objective of U.S. policy and a major U.S. national security interest. The second is to try to rein in Iran's destabilizing and aggressive regional behavior that Ambassador Edelman talked about, but whether it's support for terrorism, its use of proxy groups to sow sectarian and civil conflict across the region, its development and proliferation of both ballistic and precision-guided missile technology, all of those things that have tossed the Middle East into chaos over the last decade or so that we'd like to see reined in. And the third objective, which is really what the first two add up to, is to be able to move on to other more pressing long-term strategic global challenges, to not get sucked in and distracted and caught up in the Middle East, but to try to stabilize the region at least enough that U.S. attention can pivot to more urgent and important issues. I think all three of those objectives, broadly speaking, are the right ones, at least when it comes to Iran. We should want to achieve all those things. The question is the administration's strategy that it's currently pursuing going to enable it to achieve those objectives? That strategy appears to be, as Ambassador Edelman laid out, seeking re-entry into JCPOA as a means to, or a first step towards, a longer and stronger agreement, as President Biden puts it, that would allow overcoming some of the limitations of the JCPOA that Ambassador Edelman laid out, and that the Biden administration, or at least President Biden, seem to implicitly acknowledge the fact that it sunsets and that it allows major restrictions on Iran's nuclear enrichment program to lapse, and Iran to legally move right up to the brink of a nuclear weapons capability. And the fact that it doesn't cover a lot of those malign Iranian activities outside of the nuclear program that have allowed Iran to be so destabilizing. Our concern is if that you look at both what re-entering into the JCPOA would mean, as Jonathan just laid out, and the history of what the JCPOA was able to accomplish or not accomplish during the period when it was enacted between 2015 and 2018, there's reason to doubt that this path is going to lead the Biden administration to its objectives. First of all, if we re-enter into JCPOA in this more for less scenario that Jonathan laid out, our analysis leads us to believe that we're going to remain stuck in the JCPOA. That is to say, that any prospects for this longer and stronger deal that President Biden has said he wants are going to evaporate quickly. And that's for several reasons. The first of which is, as Ambassador Edelman and Jonathan laid out, it seems like re-entry into JCPOA is going to require the United States to give up a large swath of its sanctions that are currently in place on Iran, not just the nuclear-related sanctions as envisioned by JCPOA, but sanctions that are in place as related to Iranian terrorist activity and sponsorship, its ballistic missile program, its human rights abuses. And once we do that, then there's little leverage left with which to negotiate or trying to get Iran to stop doing those things that we just lifted sanctions on it for. Secondly, re-entry into JCPOA, which President Biden, Jake Sullivan, and others have argued is imperative because Iran's nuclear program is developing quickly, and there's a need to put Iran's nuclear program in a box. At least that's the term that Jake Sullivan uses. The fear is that the JCPOA would be a tissue-thin box at best, because of many of those sunsets provisions that Jonathan listed are coming up rather quickly, including in 2023, when, according to the JCPOA, the United Nations is supposed to resolve the Iran issue, which would mean the sanctions in place under UN Security Council Resolution 2231 would lapse, and the JCPOA calls on Congress to legally lift all sanctions on Iran, not just through the issue of presidential waivers, as had been done before, but actually to get rid of the laws that put in place those sanctions, which means that within 2 years, under JCPOA itself, we're imagining a situation in which there is no more ability to sanction Iran, and at least certainly not the snapback provision that the Obama and Biden administrations have indicated would be a failsafe. But there's also the concern that because within the next 4 years, Iran would be able to start enriching more uranium with more centrifuges, Iran would have very little incentive without sanctions in place, without the fear of snapback, to negotiate and agree to greater limitations on its nuclear program, let alone limitations on its ballistic missile program or its regional activities. And I think the greater fear is that if we look at how Iran behaved in the aftermath of the JCPOA, whether that is the seizure of American sailors as hostages just days before the deal legally went into effect in January of 2016, its escalation of regional conflict into Yemen with support for the Houthis after the deal went into effect, its harassment of US naval vessels in the Persian Gulf, Iran became more aggressive. It was not only enriched and enabled in its aggression through the sanctions relief that it got, but it also felt a measure of impunity because it considered the US to be so tied to the JCPOA that it wouldn't risk upsetting it by confronting Tehran. And so our fear is that by re-entering into the JCPOA, the Biden administration is going to be undermining its own objectives of trying to get a longer and stronger deal, because it will be giving up any leverage that it has on Iran, and will actually be ushering in a new period of greater instability in the Middle East that's going to see greater need for the United States to remain involved there rather than some form of stability which might allow us to put our attention and our resources elsewhere. And so while the objectives of the administration might be the right one, the approach seems counterproductive. And I'll be happy to talk more about that in questions, but let me turn it over to John Hanna to talk about the regional picture.
Great. Well, thank you, Blaise. And let me add my thanks to everybody in Representative Correa's office and everybody else for joining today. And thank you for your patience and letting us share some of these views with you on this really important topic. As most of you are probably aware, President Biden and his team promised upon entering office that among their highest foreign policy priorities would be repairing relations with America's allies after the strains that had been placed on many of these partnerships during the Trump years. And I think to a large extent, they've been true to their word on that, especially in Europe, but also in Asia, where a great many of our traditional partners, I think, did genuinely heave a sigh of relief at what they saw as the return to something approaching normal order in the White House and an American administration that does put a much higher premium on the value of alliances and multilateralism and the intrinsic importance of longstanding, important, valuable institutions like NATO, for instance. And I think they deserve, a degree of credit for that. But I would say also that the one region where the reestablishment of trust and confidence with old partners has been much less apparent under President Biden has been the Middle East. And I say that even in the wake of President Biden's stalwart defense of Israel's right to defend itself and defend its population in this recent war against Hamas, which I think is also a very positive thing and much to the administration's credit that they deserve praise for. But Hamas for Israel, from a strategic standpoint, is really more of a sideshow. Iran and the Iranian nuclear threat and regional aggression are the main show for Israel. And that's where it's going to judge its relationship ultimately with the Biden administration. I don't think I'm saying anything particularly controversial when I say that in their heart of hearts, most of America's traditional friends in the Middle East, from Israel to Saudi Arabia, from Egypt to the United Arab Emirates, made it pretty clear during our election campaign that they would have preferred to see President Trump reelected. I think there's lots of different reasons why that's the case, some of them quite complicated that we don't have time to get into today. But in no small measure, I do think it's fair to say that a good part of it had to do with their very strong support for the Trump administration's Iran policy. First and foremost, its fierce opposition and withdrawal from the JCPOA, and the administration's view that Iran was far and away the region's greatest threat that could only be contained through a policy of constant political, economic, and military pushback that came to be known as President Trump's maximum pressure strategy. And while I don't think any of these countries would say that everything President Trump did, either in the Middle East or with regard to Iran specifically, at least as it was carried out in practice on the grounds, was perfect, I do think they all firmly believe that President Trump got the really big first order questions about the nature of the Iranian threat and how best to deal with it fundamentally right. And they, of course, contrasted that with what they heard coming from Joe Biden and his foreign policy team, which was basically a promise, on the one hand, to return to the JCPOA that many of President Biden's advisors had helped negotiate under President Obama, and to abandon President Trump's maximum pressure campaign, as well as a pretty harsh critique of the way President Trump had handled relations with many of our traditional Arab allies in the Middle East, particularly regimes like Saudi Arabia and Egypt. And the Biden team's promised to be much tougher on the leaders of those governments in areas from human rights to the war in Yemen and beyond. So all of these countries, I think, are now very worried about the course that the United States is currently on, especially when it comes to the JCPOA. I don't think they disagree with anything that they've heard here today or with the detailed analysis in Jensen's most recent report about the risks involved in going back to the JCPOA and providing Iran's Revolutionary Guards with massive sanctions relief. All of these countries are convinced that going down that road will, in fact, result in Iran becoming a nuclear weapons threshold state before the end of this decade, while supercharging Iran's support for terrorism and regional aggression and its efforts to try and become the dominant power in the Middle East. Now, the difference, of course, for these countries, in contrast to all our partners in Europe who are applauding administration's return to the desire to return to the JCPOA, all of our allies in the Middle East are live directly within the shadow of the Iranian threat. They're very much on the front lines in this conflict, so to speak. They're the only countries directly within range of Iran's ballistic missiles. They're the only countries that have regularly been targeted by Iran's subversion and aggression and its terrorist network of regional proxies. They live with this threat day in and day out and have viewed it up close for years. And for these countries, it's an existential matter, literally one of life and death. And in Israel's case, of course, as I'm sure you know, that's quite explicit in Iranian foreign policy doctrine, which it declares openly and proudly on a very regular basis that one of its highest foreign policy priorities is Israel's eventual destruction. So it's obviously a matter of great distress and concern to these countries that their most important friend and partner, the United States, country that they've always looked up to guarantee their security, appears set now on a course that they almost unanimously believe will end up greatly emboldening their worst enemy and dramatically exacerbating the threat that they currently face from Iran. They believe that they're the countries that have the most at stake, they have the most to lose, they know the Iranian regime best, and yet their views, their interests, and their warnings are being, at least they feel, the perception is they're being largely disregarded, shunted aside, and sacrificed in the cause of reaching some kind of new accommodation with Iran that they believe will at best pause its nuclear program for but a few more years, while funneling billions of dollars into Iranian coffers and its campaign of violence and destabilizing the Middle East. So this, of course, is, if you're an American official, is generally not a good situation to be putting yourself in. It inevitably triggers a potentially dangerous dynamic in which these countries believe that they can no longer really rely on the leadership of the United States, and that they increasingly will need to begin taking matters into their own hands to protect their own interests, and without regard to US policy or US preferences. Now, that's most clearly, I think, the case with Israel, where not only Prime Minister Netanyahu, but several other Israeli political and military leaders have been quite explicit about their belief that a return to the JCPOA would be, in a word, disastrous for them, that they will not be bound by any new agreement that the Biden administration reaches with Iran, and of their determination to do whatever is necessary to deal with the Iranian threat. And let me just quote something that Prime Minister Netanyahu said just a few days ago, actually, before Secretary of State Blinken showed up in Israel. He said that while, especially in the wake of the Gaza conflict, Israel values our friend, the United States, very much, and their US support is part of our national security. He said, but ensuring that the Ayatollahs will not stop the thousands of years of existence of the Jewish people will require us, Israel, to make courageous and independent decisions. With or without a new nuclear deal, we will do everything in Israel to prevent Iran from arming itself with a nuclear weapon, because that is our existence. So inevitably, what I think is going to happen is that if we re-enter the JCPOA, it will lead Israel to a much greater sense of urgency to address the Iranian threat sooner rather than later, and through much more aggressive and potentially risky military operations and covert actions, some of which we've seen over the course of the last year. And all of which, I think, somewhat ironically, given the Biden administration's hopes, as Blaise laid out, that restoring the JCPOA will actually calm tensions in the region, that it could actually end up significantly increasing the chances of another major Middle Eastern war breaking out, and one that almost certainly will wreak almost unprecedented devastation and instability in the Middle East, which, again, as Blaise said, will inevitably, and in very dangerous ways, probably draw in the United States. I should say that while I think some of this analysis could change at the margins, depending on whether or not Benjamin Netanyahu remains as Israel's prime minister, or whether he's replaced by a more centrist type of leader, I don't think it will really alter the strategic picture or the strategic situation for Israel. Because despite all the political turmoil and the multiple elections that Israel has had over the past couple of years, they've had there's quite a remarkable degree of consensus across the political spectrum in Israel, and certainly within its influential defense and security establishment, when it comes to what they see as the extreme dangers of a return to the JCPOA and the need for Israel to be prepared to take any and all necessary actions to protect itself. Now, when it comes to the way other regional states beyond Israel will respond to an American return to the JCPOA, I think there's somewhat greater uncertainty. Privately, I think they are, as I said, very much opposed to the move. I think they will see it as a dire threat to their security. They will feel increasingly that they can't rely on the United States and that they will increasingly have to adjust their own policies to protect their interests as best they can. But unlike Israel, I think that could lead them into policies of some form of appeasement or accommodation as they desperately seek to keep the Iranian threat at bay by buying into an Iranian extortion and protection racket in the region, including perhaps even scaling back in some areas their diplomatic, security, and intelligence cooperation with the United States. And I should say, with their eagerness to go forward in deepening and expanding some of their relationships with Israel that have really required, in my view, a heavy degree of American involvement and support and assistance that the United States has been crucial to those relationships and the confidence that these countries have in the United States. And in the history, frankly, of many of these states over the past several decades, including Saudi Arabia, there's plenty of historical precedent for this kind of hedging behavior, hedging their bets with their enemies. But I also think there's a significant risk, as our report lays out, that at least several of these states could go in the opposite direction and to the opposite extreme, in particular, by making arrangements to ramp up their own nuclear programs and develop their own options for having nuclear weapons. Saudi Arabia's de facto leader, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, has been very explicit about his intentions in this regard on more than one occasion. Over the past few years, he said if Iran is given increased license by the world to build an industrial scale nuclear enrichment program, Saudi Arabia won't be left behind and it won't hesitate to match Iran step for step. Egypt and Turkey have hinted at much the same. And there's already lots of speculation, rumors, but also some evidence that there are, in fact, some facilities now being constructed in Saudi Arabia with the help, in particular from China, that involve a Saudi nuclear program and a ballistic missile program. Russia, of course, is also deeply engaged with countries in the region to help them build out their nuclear programs without many, if any, of the stringent safeguards and limitations that the United States, for instance, requires. And all of this is not even to mention the kind of worrying assistance that could come from states like Pakistan, which has one of the fastest growing nuclear weapons stockpiles in the world, or from North Korea, both of which countries have had extensive relationships in dealing in the Arab world. All of this, of course, if it actually were to come to pass, would create a real proliferation nightmare in what is already the world's most combustible region, resulting in multiple states possessing nuclear weapons with inadequate or non-existent command and control procedures, flight times for ballistic missiles measured in just a few minutes, and everyone essentially on a nuclear hair trigger. That is a formula for true disaster. And if there's any significant risk, I would say that a US return to the JCPOA could trigger that kind of scenario. It merits a very serious rethinking about the wisdom of such a strategy, certainly by the administration, but also by people in Congress. Now, before I close, let me just add one other significant risk that I alluded to a little bit above that could flow from a return to the JCPOA and the deep insecurity it's likely to cause among our traditional friends in the Middle East. And here I'm talking about an increasing likelihood that in an effort to compensate for what they will view as a loss of US protection and support, many of these countries will increasingly try to hedge by looking for any help they can get from other outside powers like China and like Russia, both of which I should say, in contrast to the United States, are looking to expand rather than reduce their own presence and influence in the Middle East, often at America's expense. So especially in the context of a US strategy that purportedly wants to focus increasing attention and resources on great power competition, and that seeks to really mobilize a global coalition of like-minded countries to counter the growing threat posed, especially by a rising China, pursuing a policy like re-entering the JCPOA that will likely have the opposite effect by driving our allies to try and become closer to China and more accommodating of its interests, could be, to say the least, quite problematic and counterproductive for US interests. Sorry to go on for so long. I could say more, but I don't know if we've got any time for discussion. But thanks again for your patience and attention, and I'll throw it back to Mike if he's still with us. Maybe not. Blaise, do you?
Sure, happy to open it up to any questions. Harris, are we just taking questions through the chat feature?
Yeah, exactly, and the Q&A. If you have a question, please please type it into the question and answer box on the bottom of your screen, and Blaise will ask it on your behalf.
John and Ambassador Edelman, let me perhaps toss the first one that we have to you, which asks, how does the administration's comment that the Abraham Accords are dead on arrival play into the Iran situation?
Well, I guess I would just say that it's obviously not helpful, and I think it can, despite the Biden administration's proclamations that the Abraham Accords are the one feature of Trump's foreign policy, maybe in addition to its tougher approach to China, that the Biden administration can sign on to. There's been very little evidence in its actual policy that it sees the Abraham Accords as the significant historical accomplishment that it was, and the potentially significant strategic asset that those relationships and those normalization deals could be for United States interests and United States security in a more stable and prosperous Middle East. And I think the recent statements kind of downplaying the importance of the accords, or even disrespecting them to a degree, only confirms for countries in the region that really we're looking to the United States to help convene and mobilize this interest in close relations, and to support it and to limit the risks of these kinds of normalization deals in the face of criticisms and attacks from the likes of Iran and Syria and other bad actors in the region. That this will can only hamper, I think, the efforts to advance this truly historic process.
Thanks, John. Just wanting to be respectful of everyone's time. Any 15-second final comments, either John or Jonathan, as we wrap up?
No, none for me. Thank you.
No, I just again thank everybody, and just really I would underscore and reiterate Mike's point at the top that Congress does have a significant role to play here, that there is legislation on the books that confers that a serious responsibility of oversight on Congress for any Iran nuclear deal, particularly one that impacts a incredibly important sanctions regime that Congress has helped put in place, that Congress has both the right and the duty to really grade the administration's homework here and make sure that this deal is really something that, with all of the trade-offs, is going to really help advance the security of both the United States and its allies in the Middle East, and make that region a more secure and stable place not just for the next couple of years, but for the next several decades. So thanks, everybody.
So let me just remind everyone that particularly as Congress takes up its right and duty to review whatever agreement gets struck, potentially in Vienna, that JINSA is a terrific resource on analysis on Iran's nuclear program and its regional behavior. I encourage everybody to check out our latest reports, which can be found at jinsa.org, or contact us directly if we can be of any assistance or you have any questions. But thank you for your time, and have a great day, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you all.